We have Dr. Phil Fernandes with us. Phil has been here with us almost since the beginning, I think the second year that we started this back in 2013. And he himself, he's a pastor. He's got a doctorate in apologetics and a pastor, senior pastor at the Trinity Bible Fellowship across the pond here. But he's also president of the Institute of Biblical Defense, and its purpose is to train people in apologetics. So he's got a lot of it on his website. He's got a book table there. You can see he's written, about 10 different books at this point on apologetics topics. And so he likes to dig deep into the topics that we cover here. So tonight he's going to speak on the topic of the Nephilim. What are the Nephilim? What were the Nephilim? And there's probably the main coverage of that is just in a few verses. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4 introduces that topic. And it's a controversial topic. Different people have different views, and there's a long history of the different views that the early church and the Jewish scholars had as well. So he's going to cover the history of that, the differences of views that people have, and the evidence for and against each. So, Phil, come on up. And we will have time for Q&A after.
Let's open up with a quick word of prayer. Father, in Jesus' precious name, I just pray, Lord, that you would anoint me to proclaim your truth. I know this is a controversial subject, a topic that even good Christian brothers and sisters may disagree on. And so I just pray that you would give us a spirit of charity and grace, and just recognize that we Christians don't agree on everything. But whatever the case, Lord, if nothing else, just inspire us to study your word more deeply and look at passages that are often ignored. And so, Lord, we love you, but we just pray that you would help us to love you even more. Be with us tonight. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. Okay, so the sons of God and the Nephilim, this is one of the probably the first time I've ever spoke on it, except for like a little tiny Bible study that we had years ago. Very controversial topic, and it all stems from Genesis 6, 1 to 4. What exactly goes on here? I don't know if those words are big enough for you to read. I don't know if you noticed there were handouts out there with the slides on them, but even the words are even smaller there. But I'm going to read Genesis 6, 1 to 4, and then we're going to try to discuss this issue of the Nephilim. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, the word there for giants, the New King James translates Nephilim as giants, okay? And it does so also in the only other passage where the word is mentioned, and that's Numbers 13:33. We'll look at that in just a minute. But Nephilim literally means like fallen ones, or those who fall upon others. And but we're going to see why it's the Nephilim, this offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, where it produced, I believe, giant offspring. And so we're going to talk about that. Now, the sons of God, in the Hebrew, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I'm probably going to butcher it almost as much as I butcher English. But B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God, in the Old Testament, it's only mentioned a few times. but it always means angelic beings. So if it doesn't mean angels here, this is the only passage in the Old Testament where B'nai Ha-Elohim doesn't mean angelic beings. In fact, the Greek Septuagint was translated by Jews. They translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek because many of the Jews who had been dispersed throughout Babylon and throughout the ancient world could no longer read Hebrew. So they began to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Koine Greek or Common Greek. And the way they chose to translate, this is about 200 years before Christ, the sons of God was angeloi toi theou, which basically means angels of God. So for the translators of the Septuagint, there was no real question for them. Now with the daughters of man, the word literally is Adam. So there are some that try to say, well, maybe it was the sons of Seth trying to intermarry with the daughters of Cain. But here we're talking, it's not merely the daughters of Cain, it's the daughters of Adam, all the ones that could trace their roots back to Adam. So these are not the sons of Seth marrying the daughters of Cain. They're angelic beings taking bodily form and marrying female humans. That's the position I'm going to talk about tonight. There's two variations of that position. Now, something else that I'm not dogmatic about, but it does mention that Noah was perfect in his generations. And it talks about all flesh had been corrupted or defiled. So some scholars, not all, but some scholars think that it was basically saying that Noah's family line had not been infested with this angelic invasion into the human genome, basically, the human line. And so it's just interesting that those are mentioned. Now, Nephilim, as I've mentioned, is the fallen ones, but when you read about the Nephilim, you see that they're not only mighty men, men of renown, they're also described as being very big men, like we're like grasshoppers before them, things of that sort. So the Septuagint translates the word Nephilim with the word gigantes, okay? And the King James Version translates Nephilim, and also a word later on used, the Rephaim, with the words giants. So you're going to see this in a lot of passages. We don't have time to look up all the passages, but if you're like thinking, sitting there thinking, the Bible doesn't talk about giants, just look at all the verses that I list throughout this, and you're going to find an awful lot of verses, especially like in books like Deuteronomy and Numbers, that do talk about beings of enormous size. And so the current views among evangelicals, I had one of the guys from the board of this ministry listed 6 of them, and I'm aware of all 6, but I'm just going to focus on 3, which I consider the 3 most viable views for Christians. And one is the natural view, that the sons of Seth married the daughters of Cain. And so that there are those who hold to that, and there are good godly Christians who hold that position. St. Augustine held that position, okay, in about 380 AD. But my problem with it, though, is literally the sons of Adam. So that includes Seth and Cain and any other sons of Adam and Eve, and then they wouldn't produce giants. And in the Old Testament, the phrase "sons of God" are angels. Okay, so I don't hold to that natural view. I hold to the supernatural view. Now, there's 2 main ones. The one that I hold to, which is the oldest position of the church, the early church fathers, the ones that talked about it, until I think it was Julius Africanus, all held that there were angels that took bodily form and married human females. But since the 1970s, guys like Henry Morris, a great young earth creation scientist, and now John MacArthur, I remember Chuck Swindoll held the second position that maybe angels possessed human males and then they married human females and produced the race of giants. I think that if we just stick with the text, we've got the angels taking on bodily form and marrying human females and producing a race of chimeras, half angel, half human. And now the ancient traditional view, virtually every Jewish or Christian writer before St. Augustine, 380 AD, interpreted Genesis 6 as talking about angelic beings taking bodily form and cohabiting with human females and producing a race of giant chimeras. I was actually corrected on this, that the hybrids wouldn't really cover it. It's more of a chimera. But whatever the case, that's the ancient traditional view of Christians and Jews. So if I'm wrong, the early church was wrong. If I'm wrong, the ancient Jews were wrong about their own literature. And here's just a list of some of those who held a supernatural interpretation before 380 AD. The Greek Septuagint, as I mentioned, the Jewish philosopher Philo around 50 AD, Josephus, who died in 97 AD, not only did he say that they were angels who cohabited with female humans, but he said that their offspring was the basis, was the true story behind all the ancient Greek and Roman myths. So he was saying the Greek and Roman mythology is an inaccurate retelling of a true story that goes back to this time. Now you have the book of Enoch, the book of Giants, the book of Jubilees, Ben Sirach, all written before Jesus walked the earth. Now the book of Enoch, some people place too much emphasis on that. It's not in our Bibles and it shouldn't be there, okay? But keep in mind, Jude did quote one passage from there in his letter, and the early church was very familiar with the book of Enoch and held it in high regard. We now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now have access to the Hebrew book of Enoch, which goes back to even before Jesus walked the earth. But it was held in high regard, and all these ancient Jewish books, Ben Sirach is in the Catholic Bible, shouldn't be there, but it is. And but whatever the case, they take the angels cohabiting with female humans and producing the Nephilim. Also among church fathers, Clement of Rome. So a lot of people think he wrote 95 AD. Well, he said the temple was still standing when he wrote, which places it in 70 AD. And I think he was a colleague of Paul's, but he didn't become the bishop of Rome until 95 AD. And in his letter, he never really mentions that he's the bishop of Rome, because I don't think he is yet. He's just a colleague of Paul. And so I think going back to even 70 AD, he held this view. Justin Martyr in 150 AD, Irenaeus in 180 AD, Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria about 220 AD, Tertullian about 220 AD, Ambrose, Jerome, and Jerome was he translated the Bible into Latin, the Latin Vulgate. He was a Hebrew and Greek scholar, and Eusebius, Lactantius, and Commodianus. So all you have these, all church fathers is almost unanimous. Now, in 220 AD, those who disagreed, Julius Africanus, in about 220 AD, was the first and the only Christian scholar to disagree at that point. Now, by about 350 to 400 AD, Athanasius, Augustine, John Cassian, and John Chrysostom then began to promote the new non-supernaturalistic view that the sons of Seth married the sons of Cain. But I agree with the earliest interpretation of this. Now, due to Augustine's influence, from 380 AD straight on through the Reformation in the 1500s and into the 1900s, the non-supernatural view became dominant. St. Augustine had a tremendous impact and influence on the Western Church, whether it was Roman Catholicism or the Protestant Church, and influenced a lot of people, Christian leaders, and their thought. Only in the 1900s did the supernatural view make a comeback. I'm just finding out, though, now that there were writers, there were pastors and scholars in the 1700s and the 1800s who were already going back to the supernatural view of angels cohabiting with female humans and producing the Nephilim. But at this particular point, one of the Wenham brothers, I think it's George Wenham, an Old Testament scholar, but he basically said in evangelical circles, the supernatural view is now the current view. And he thinks it's because that's what the text says. And so history of the interpretation of this passage and linguistic studies of the words, favor the supernatural view. And I would argue that Jude and Peter clearly interpreted Genesis 6 in the supernatural way. We'll look at that in just a minute. Now, the main objection comes up that Jesus said angels do not marry, that in the resurrection humans will be like the angels. We won't get married or be given in marriage, okay? But Jesus clearly says in Matthew 22:30 and Mark 12:25 that he is speaking of the angels of God in heaven do not marry. The obedient angels do not marry. It says nothing about fallen angels who have chosen to leave their proper domain. Now we have to keep in mind here, and Jonathan Sarfati does a great job on this in his work on Genesis chapters 1 through 11, that the unfallen angels, the good angels who visited Lot, they had the physical appearance of men, okay? They could eat food and have their feet washed. And then the evil men of Sodom thought they could rape them. Of course, the angels blinded the evil men of Sodom. So, but Jonathan Sarfati says if they could eat food, that meant that they had to have a digestive system. So when angels take on bodily form, it comes complete with human appearance and a digestive system. Who's to say that it would not also include sexual organs as well? And the angels are always depicted as male, by the way, and just to throw that out there. Now, an area where myself and Jonathan Sarfati would disagree, I believe that there were Nephilim after the flood, and we'll look at the passage that deals with that, Numbers 13:33. But he believes that because it's a bad report from the spies that went into the promised land, that we could just dismiss it. They were just making it up. But no, when they said that, look, we're like grasshoppers before them, the Anakim are there, and then it seems to be even a parenthesis that maybe even Moses added to it, that the Anakim are the descendants of the Nephilim. Well, we know, the flood was global, and only Noah and his family survived it. So that means that if there are Nephilim after the flood, there had to be some kind of second invasion of angelic beings. But Nephilim after the flood, you've got the Anakim that are mentioned, They're the descendants of Anak, and even his father was supposed to be greater than him, named Arba. And so you can see that in Joshua chapter 14, verse 15. In fact, let me read a couple of these passages here. Joshua 14. And verse 15. Oops, in the wrong book. And the name of Hebron formerly was Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had rest from war. This is when Joshua was conquering the promised land. Joshua 15, verse 13. Now to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he gave a share among the children of Judah according to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, namely Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. Then it talks about his sons and all. Look, Deuteronomy chapter 1. In fact, let's read the Numbers first. Numbers 13:33. I have it on a future slide, but I don't want to. I can skip ahead real quick. We'll have to come back to that. So Numbers 13, 31 to 33. But the men who had gone up with them said, so these are the spies, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they spied out, saying, I believe it's a bad report because they're saying God's not going to give us the victory. I don't believe it's a bad report because they're lying about the people in the land. The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants, the Nephilim, and then it says in parentheses, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, the Nephilim. I think that might have been added by Moses to what they were saying. But there we saw the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. And so this is the only other passage that contains the word Nephilim. It's mentioned twice there. The New King James translates it as giants. But let me come back to the earlier slide there. Okay, so the Anakim, we're told, the descendants of Anak are the descendants of Nephilim. Then another name for giants is the Rephaim, which the New King James again translates as giants. Okay, but in Deuteronomy chapter 3, starts off in verse 1. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. And then you go down further to verse 11, and it says, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the giants. That's the Rephaim. Goliath is not called the Rephaim in 1 Samuel chapter 17, but his sons are called sons of the Rapha, which is a form of Rephaim. So Goliath is later on referred to as the giant. But Og, king of Bashan, only he remained of the remnant of the giants of the Rephaim. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. Is not in Rabbah of the people of Ammon? Is it not in Rabbah of the people of Ammon? 9 cubits in its length and 4 cubits in its width, according to the standard cubit. Now they're bragging about how big this guy is, calling he's a giant. Well, it so happens that it's either his bed or his coffin is 13 and a half feet long and 6 feet wide. Now, I'm only 5.5 feet tall, okay? But I don't want to sleep in a 5.5 foot tall bed. So if it's talking about his bed, he's not quite that big. But the fact that they're telling you he's a giant and then telling you how big his bed is gives you some indication. So I would not be surprised if he was a 11 or 12 footer. This is a big dude that Moses and his guys took out. Also, 1 Samuel 17, you have Goliath. He's 6 cubits and a span, which means he's approximately 9.5 feet tall. Okay? Now, some will go with the Septuagint on that. The Septuagint only puts him at 4 cubits and a span, which would only make him 6'9". Okay? The biggest guy I ever boxed, not weight-wise, I boxed guys who were heavier than him, but height, and then when you factor in weight, was a football player in the Marine Corps. I weighed 165 pounds at the time. I was in my early 20s. He was in his early 20s. But he was 6'7". His name was John Hamilton, 6'7", 270 pounds. And one thing I noticed, they think I didn't know how, he was a football player, he didn't know how to box. But I noticed that his solar plexus were even with my face. So all I did was slip under his punches and bang hard right hands into his solar plexus. And after a minute and a half, he couldn't breathe anymore. He was like a bunny rabbit like that. Great guy, though. He's a really good guy, strong guy, but he couldn't box. I don't think 3,000 years from now, guys are going to talk about, that mighty warrior, Phil Fernandes, whooped a guy who was 6'7". Okay? If Goliath was 6'9", I don't mess with 6'9" guys just walking around. Maybe in the ring, but not outside the ring. And they better be old like me right at this point in my life. And I don't think we'd be talking about it 3,000 years later. Now, if he was 9.5 foot tall, yes. Also, he's got a spear like a weaver's beam. It's kind of like a real long spear that's about as thick as a baseball bat, okay? And then the point of the spear weighs 15 pounds. Now, Shaquille O'Neal, I think, would be a great warrior if he was in his prime. He's a 7-footer, but I don't think he could effectively use in combat a spear that thick with a point on it that weighs 15 pounds. Just check me out on it. Just get a long wooden stick. Go buy one at Home Depot, place I never go, and then take a 15-pound dumbbell and duct tape it to it and see how far you could throw it. Then if you got a buddy who's a big guy, see how far they can throw it. I don't think you're going to be an effective warrior with that. He also wore kind of like his bulletproof vest, his armor, weighed 125 pounds. Okay? And he's an undefeated champion because he's still alive. So that's Goliath. Then his sons are mentioned, and they're wimps next to him, but they're still really big guys. But when you look at the size of their equipment, it's nowhere near as big as his, okay? And they're the sons of the Rapha, the sons of the giant. So you got King Og of Bashan, Goliath, and Goliath's sons. Then in Deuteronomy 2, 18 to 22, okay, God's going to give them the people of Ammon. It says, and then in verse 20, that was also regarded as a land of giants, a land of Rephaim. Giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. I know Jonathan Sarfati doesn't believe the Nephilim were giants, but it's plastered all over the Old Testament that whenever they're talking about the Nephilim or they're talking about the Rephaim, they're talking about people that are incredibly tall. But the Lord destroyed them before them, and they dispossessed them and dwelt in their land. And Deuteronomy 2, 8 to 12 mentions the Amim. And there they're passing over through Edom and that area. In verse 10, The Emim had dwelt there in times past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. They were also regarded as giants, Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them the Emim. Okay? So now there's some passages about the Horites and the Amorites, which are, kind of questionable. There's something to look into, but I think that we could see the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, and the Emims were people that were considered gigantically tall. Okay? And I already talked about Og's bed or coffin, 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. He's called a Rephaim, a giant. So I think he might have been 11 or 12 footer. Okay? And then he'd be comfortable in his bed. Goliath, now 500 years later, Goliath's on the scene. He's about 9.5 feet tall. His spear is like a weaver's beam with a 15-pound tip, and his bronze armor coat weighed 125 pounds. Now it's interesting that David's bodyguard, Benaiah, this dude was a bad dude. This dude makes Bruce Lee looks wimpy, okay? And this guy killed a lion, 2 lion-like men. He says it really, literally, it's 2 lion men. I don't even know what that means, okay? I'm assuming maybe they were like warriors with the ferocity of lions, but I don't know. Could there have been more genetic messing with the human genetic code? I don't know. But he ended up killing a 7'6" Egyptian warrior with the guy's own spear. Okay? Now, he wasn't specifically called a giant. He's just called a man of great stature. And today's warrior giants, you see them in the NFL, you see them in the NBA, and today's warrior giants that don't have a disease that we usually call giantism and all that affects the pituitary gland and the growth hormones don't turn off. Those people usually die young. They're usually not very tough. It's very unfortunate, okay? But today's warrior giants, the big guys who can throw down, okay? You find them like on the offensive or defensive line in the NFL. They're like 6'7", 6'8", all the way on up to about 7'6", 7'7". Once you get over that, we have people that have health challenges, and I pray for them. But in these 2 passages, 1 Chronicles 11, 22 and 23, and 2 Samuel 23, 20 and 21, talking about the same events, we're told that Benaiah locked horns with a 7'6" Egyptian warrior, but he's called a man of great stature. He might have been a giant, but he might not have been a giant. So it might be that the giant's got to be bigger than that, okay? I really, the word of Tim Chaffee, I'll bring up his book on a slide in a bit, but his work, I agree with him that the warrior giants of the past were probably between 8 and 12 feet tall. Now, you might have seen like the Photoshop things of like 36-foot tall giants and all. Those are Photoshopped. They're not legit, okay? There are some scientific principles which would argue against any human getting that big. But I think that Chaffee makes a pretty good argument that they could have been as big as 8 to 12 feet tall, okay? And so this guy might have just been a purely human man of great stature that Benaiah killed. Now, we already read this passage, and there at verse 33, there we saw the giants, the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. This is a bad report. They're saying the people are too big for us to defeat. God's not going to give us the victory. We shouldn't go in the promised land. Gee, it's too bad. We should have never left Egypt. We had it so good when we were in slavery in Egypt. I think that the bad report is them saying, wimping out, and saying we shouldn't go and fight these giants. But I don't think that they were lying about the giants, because from the other passages we see that you have these giant entities in the promised land. It's crazy too, because they infested the promised land, but the Jews even had to fight some of them, like King Og of Bashan, before entering the promised land. It was almost like the initial satanic conspiracy was to pollute the genetic code of humans so that the seed of the woman could not come to crush the head of the serpent. Genesis 3:15. It seems like the next phase in this activity was to keep the Jews from taking the promised land. Okay? And that's just a little bit of speculation there. But the main reason why I hold to the supernatural view is Jude verses 6 and 7, and 1 Peter and 2 Peter. And so Jude verses 6 and 7 says, "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. As Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal life." So Jude is saying, hey, look, I'm going to give you some Old Testament examples. Remember when the angels left their proper domain and then God placed them under judgment? And that was very similar to Sodom and Gomorrah. In the same manner as those angels, they gave themselves over to sexual immorality and went after strange flesh. That's when the men of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to rape the two angels who were with Lot. And so here we find out some angels, you just read the book of Zechariah, read Job chapters 1 and 2, read Revelation chapter 12, read in Peter where he says that Satan roams the earth, seeking whom he may devour. Angels have, even fallen angels to this day, have access to earth and to heaven and roam freely. Their judgment is yet to come. Satan, we even find out day and night, he accuses the brethren before God's throne room. But he'll be thrown out 3.5 years before the return of Christ. Read Revelation chapter 12. And so you got the fallen angels roaming freely, but Jude says, yeah, but there's some angels that left their proper domain and committed sin similar to the men of Sodom, and God has chained them up. Okay? And then look at 1 Peter 3, 18 to 20. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom he also went, so by the power of the Holy Spirit, after he rose from the dead, he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. So he's talking about spirits who are in prison. By the way, spirits in the New Testament only refers to humans when they're called like spirits of men. When it's just spirits, all the other places in the New Testament, it's referring to angels. And so apparently after Jesus' resurrection, he went and made a proclamation to spirits in prison. This may be the abyss, the bottomless pit. Remember the Luke chapter 8? The demon said, I am legion. The demon said, I am legion, for we are many. And they begged Jesus not to throw them into the abyss. And now with Jesus, when he preached to them, he wasn't saying, hey, accept the salvation message. He's saying, you guys lost. I'm the seed of the woman. I was conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary. You guys tried to kill me when I was being born. Just read Revelation 12. Satan was using Herod to try to kill him. But I grew up, became a strong young Jewish male, and I conquered. I died on the cross for the sins of mankind, and I have risen from the dead. You guys lost. I have come, I have conquered, and salvation has come to mankind. I think Jesus was talking to some fierce but defeated entities when he went there and preached to the spirits in prison who were formerly disobedient in the days of Noah. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 6. Peter says, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell," the literal word there in the Greek is Tartarus. It's the word that we see in Greek mythology, where the Titans went. Okay, the offspring of the gods and human females who are giants. And Peter says, well, that's probably just a twisted story, retelling of the true story. But God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. Well, you see with Jude and with Peter, they're taking you step by step through some key godless events in the book of Genesis. Angels who sinned before the flood, okay? And then God saves Noah through the flood, and then the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? And so here's some books I'd recommend if you want to look into this. Tim Chaffee, if you go to the Ark Encounter, Ken Ham's got him giving lectures over there. So even though Ken Ham doesn't agree with him on this topic, it's not a big enough issue for them to divide on. By the way, Tim Chaffee, he probably should be here giving this lecture today instead of me, because he's 6'9", okay? I do stand well over 5 feet tall, but I'm not 6'9", and but his book Fallen, The Sons of God and the Nephilim, it's an excellent read. Also, now this book is interesting. This is something, you need to look into this. But when the Nephilim fled, when the giants fled as the Jews were conquering, if I'm correct, there's Nephilim after the flood. When the giants are being defeated, some of them fled. And we have reports like from all over the world, but it's amazing how many reports we have in North, Central, and South America of giant bones being found in giants. So the Nephilim, was there a giant problem in the Americas, by Daniel A. Biddle. I think an interesting book just to look into and to consider. Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman, they're not Christians. Nice guy. Well, at least Jim Vieira's a nice guy, but they've got a book, Giants on Record, America's Hidden History, Secrets in the Mounds and the Smithsonian Files. These guys talk about, they're just like, I think there's over 1,000 articles, newspaper articles, on the finds of giant human skeletons between the 1830s and the 1930s, okay? And they were almost always, eventually Smithsonian came and took them and put them on display. And then after the 1930s, as Darwinian evolution got more and more popular, all of a sudden they're nowhere to be seen. And they start telling us, well, we really didn't have them to begin with or whatever. But you could read newspaper articles, hundreds of them, in Giants on Record. And I wasn't able to capture, I'm not really good at technology, the cover of the book, but a good book to read is A Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs, edited by David W. Burkott. He gives you ancient quotes from these guys. What did Augustine say about this? What did Athanasius say about this? And he talks about the sons of God, the Nephilim, and things of that sort. So it's definitely a good reference there. Now, this is an approximate scale. AI is not as intelligent as I thought, because I would put, like, I'd say, give me a 6-foot Israeli warrior next to a 12-foot Israeli warrior, and then I break out a ruler, and the 12-foot guy's not twice as tall as the guy. So I don't know what AI is doing with me, but whatever the case, this is as close as I could get to what Goliath would have looked like next to David. I think David didn't look wimpy like that, though, by the way. He was strong enough to pick up Goliath's sword and sever his head. Saul was the tallest of the Israelites. He was not a Nephilim. He was not a giant. He might have been a 7-footer, I don't know. But he stood head and shoulders above other Israelites. Yet, he said, David, take my armor. I'm not going to use it. And David actually tested it, put it on, and said, no, I haven't tested it. I haven't practiced with it. I'm not going to wear it. If David was like 5'2", I don't think he would have tried on the armor. So I think David was like probably a tall, skinny teenager at that point, who eventually got buffed like his big brother Eliab, okay, who was another guy who was backing down from Goliath at that point. With a 6-foot warrior, King Og of Bashan would approximately be that big. So these would be some pretty big, intimidating guys. Also, I think we need to take more seriously the story of false gods of the pagan nations. The Septuagint, 200 BC, says that God divided the nations after the Tower of Babel. Okay, God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, but God reserved Israel for himself. Now, the Hebrew Bible says that he divided the nations according to the number of the children of Israel. But that doesn't make sense, because Israel didn't have like 70 descendants. Israel wasn't even a nation at that point. Okay? And so I agree with those scholars. By the way, you go to Burkott's book, virtually all early church fathers accepted this as the proper translation, that God took angelic beings and put them in charge of the nations, but he reserved Israel, which he was going to found later through Abraham, for himself. And this makes sense with the book of Daniel, where you have high-ranking angelic beings over the affairs, the politics. This is why Paul says our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. And so, like for instance, Allah. I think Allah is real. Allah is not God. Allah is not the creator. But I think that Allah is a high-ranking, cold-blooded, fallen angel. Okay? But I think too often we think that if people believe in false gods, it's just a false god that their imagination made up. I think we need to recognize the spiritual realm is a lot uglier and a lot more fierce than meets the eye. Also, there's probably more than one fall of angels. We like this idea that when Satan fell, all the angels that fell with him. We don't know that. The sons of God cohabiting with female humans and producing a race of giant beings, that may have been their fall, that choice to do that. And then with Deuteronomy 32, God's probably placing good angels over the nations, who then say, well, instead of telling them to worship the true God, we'll call ourselves gods and try to get the people to worship us. Okay? But some fallen angels are in the abyss. And I think it's because of the Genesis 6. And if there was a later invasion, that as well. But other angels roam freely. heaven and earth. You see that in the book of Job, Zechariah. Remember, Satan goes and accuses Zerubbabel the governor and Joshua the high priest before God's throne room. In Revelation chapter 12, Satan accuses the brethren day and night before God's throne room. And in 1 Peter 5:8, Peter says that Satan roams the earth seeking whom he may devour. When Satan presented himself before God's throne room in Job 1 and 2, God said, "Where you been?" He said, "I've been on the earth, east and west." You know? And so the abyss, the bottomless pit, Peter seems to call it Tartarus. Demons beg Jesus not to send them there in Luke 8. Satan won't be chained up in the abyss until Jesus returns. I'm a premillennialist. I believe that Jesus will literally reign on earth for 1,000 years. Not all Christian scholars agree with me on that. But then after the 1,000 years and Satan's final revolt, he'll be tossed into the lake of fire forever and ever. But Satan still roams freely at this point. And it makes me kind of freak out a little bit, because who are the locusts from the abyss that get released in Revelation chapter 9? My answer is, I don't know. But anything coming from the abyss kind of freaks me out. In fact, even the Antichrist is called the beast from the abyss. So I don't know if some of Satan's baddest dudes are going to come out and mess with us. But whatever the case, I don't think that when Satan fell, automatically everybody else, all the other fallen angels, fell at that point. There may have been different falls. Now, let me mention this. Today's warrior giants are athletes. They're fully human athletes. They're usually between 6'8" and 7'7". They can throw down. I'm not going to mess with them, okay? Over that height, though, once you start pushing it, it involves the giantism disability. Now, the ancient warrior giants, these guys apparently were probably about 8 foot to 12 foot tall. And so Goliath, and they seemed to get smaller as time went on, maybe intermarrying with more purely humans. But whatever the case, there's Dan Kreff, my good buddy, the 7-foot apologist. I couldn't find my picture of me and him, because that's what Mike Riddle. Mike Riddle's a tall guy. If that's me, Dan Kreff goes like this, and he's resting his elbow on my head. Okay? And he's a 7-foot. He's a warrior giant. Why do I say he's a warrior giant? In a scrimmage game with Shaquille O'Neal, he blocked 2 of Shaquille O'Neal's dunk attempts. I don't know about you. I don't even want to try to block Shaquille O'Neal dunk attempt. In fact, Shaquille O'Neal got so mad. It was a scrimmage. They shared the same locker, both teams. And he was talking trash to Shaquille O'Neal. They were arguing, almost threw down. I'm like, that's a warrior giant, man. These are big guys there. And Yao Ming, 7'6". I found out he's only 7'5". So, but there, his coach is a normal-sized human. But this is a warrior giant. This guy can throw down. These are the kind. Goliath was not some guy with giantism like Myron and Earth, the 2 Christian psychologists. They argue the reason why David could beat Goliath was because he had giantism. His vision wasn't good. His bones were frail. Dude, you're describing a guy I could beat up, okay? No, Goliath was an undefeated. How do I know Goliath was an undefeated warrior at that point? Because he was still alive. Those guys used to fight for keeps, and but that's a current warrior giant. There's Yao Ming next to Shaquille O'Neal. I think Shaquille O'Neal was probably slouches like me. I'm about 5'5" right now. I used to tower in at around 5'5 3/4. So Shaquille O'Neal might have lost a couple inches there, but he's a 7-footer. But Yao Ming, those are big modern-day warrior giants. But the ancient warrior giants were like from 8 foot to 12 foot. Now, the guys who suffer from the disease that affects the pituitary gland, it doesn't shut off, like Robert Wadlow, his height was recorded at 8'11". But his bones were very frail. He would not have been a good warrior. and he died at the age of 22. Johann Peterson, I love this guy. They used to bill him as 8'8". He might have been 8'2" in his prime, but by the time I saw him, I thought he was in his 70s. It turns out he was only in his 60s, but he looked frail. He looked like he was 80 or 90. He was falling apart. He lived to be 71, though. But they used to call him the Viking giant. They came through New Jersey, a circus. And I said, I'll pay 25 cents to see the giant. I'm expecting to see a guy on stilts. I see a guy he's too decrepit to stand up, so he's sitting down. And sitting down on a throne, his head is like this high and about this big, and he puts a silver dollar through his ring. I'm like, and I took a liking to the guy. He was very kind, very nice guy. But I think he got the giantism thing going on there. Andre the Giant, now he could throw down, but he was in professional wrestling and stuff like that, picking up people. By the time they filmed Princess Bride, the princess only weighed about 100 pounds, and they needed strings because he couldn't hold her at that point. And I think he died in his 40s. Okay? So there's some kind of disease going on there. They listed him as 7'4", weighed about like 500 pounds. France, the Hugo brothers. Baptiste was 7'7" when his picture was taken. Scope said at the time he died, a newspaper article said he was 8'4" when he died, so he probably kept growing. But Scope said that he was over 8 feet tall. And Scopes usually, they usually rain on everybody's parade. But that's his brother, Antoine, who was only 7'5", poor guy. But look, Antoine only lived 27 years. Baptiste lived only 40 years, okay? And they suffered from familial acromegaly, okay? An overproduction of growth hormone from the pituitary gland. You know who the other 3 people in that photo are? His mom and his dad and his sister, their sister. So they got some genetic disease that their sister didn't get, and their parents obviously didn't have. They look like they got what I got. Now, the identity of demons, I'm not dogmatic on this. I go back and forth. Are demons fallen angels? Or when fallen angels come to earth, do they manifest themselves in a physical way, even though they're spirit entities in the heavenly realm? Are demons fallen angels, or are they disembodied spirits of the Nephilim? Many, if not most, of the early church fathers took the latter view. I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying, we really need to study the scriptures closely. But Rephaim, the word Rephaim is used both of giants and deceased, shadowy spirit entities in the hereafter. So I don't know, just something to throw out there. Now, let's say I'm right and Jonathan Sarfati is wrong. How do we get Nephilim after the flood? Well, the flood was global. So it wasn't like some Nephilim survived because the flood was only local. No, that's baloney. It was a global flood. I think it's doubtful that one of Noah's daughters-in-law had Nephilim blood. So I think there was probably a second invasion of the sons of God. And that's what Tim Chaffee holds to, and many other scholars. But again, this is not something to separate believers over. But we have many reports of giants after the flood in the Bible. These passages, we looked at some of them. Also in reliable historical reports outside the Bible. Magellan's voyages, his chronicler recorded giant tribes of people with lighter skin than Native Americans, and then tribal peoples. Captain John Smith on his voyages, Columbus's chronicler, Americo Vespucci, Hernando de Soto. We trust those guys and all what they said. This is what we saw. This is what we saw. This is what we saw. And then they mentioned the giant tribes. You say, baloney. Okay? They report some of them as a European would come, the tallest European would come to the bottom of the chest of these beings and all. giant skeletons, the Native American legends all talk about when the Native Americans, and they say when we first got here, there were light-skinned giants that were very violent. Some of them were cannibals, and we had to defeat them. It's crazy that the Native Americans kind of had to do, according to their legends, to giants what the Jews had to do to giants in the Promised Land. But if you think, Fernandes, only an idiot would believe this stuff. Well, then Abe Lincoln's an idiot. And when he gave his speech at Niagara Falls and in his diary, he talked about the giant skeletons found in the area of Niagara Falls, and dealing with I think that's why the New York baseball giants and the New York football giants, the baseball giants eventually moved to San Francisco. That's probably why they were called the Giants way back then, because there were reports of this in New York. And then you have the finds from 1830 to 1930. Hundreds of giant skeleton finds reported in newspapers throughout America between 1830 and 1930. Now let me just mention this. Michael Heiser, some of his views overlap with the early church fathers. Some of his views are extreme. And so you need to be very careful when you read Michael Heiser. He was a very nice guy to me, but I would attend sometimes when he'd present a paper, and I'd keep interrupting him when he'd say that, so that we see that the Bible teaches that there are many gods. And it's like metaphorically or functionally, it's like Jesus in John chapter 10 quoting from Psalm 82:6. The Bible calls entities that are not God, gods in a symbolic way. But there's only one God. He says the Jews were not monotheistic, they were polytheistic. That's baloney. So they were mono-Yahwistic. Okay? Now, Michael Heiser called himself an evangelical. I really don't think he was. Nowadays, everybody calls themselves an evangelical. You can't get kicked out of the Evangelical Theological Society anymore. These guys, the problem is not this. The problem is they're watering down inerrancy. So they're playing games with the biblical text. So even though the Old Testament calls entities gods who are not literally God, the Jews were clearly monotheistic. In other words, the Jews could handle a metaphor. Okay? A lot of Americans can't. Okay? But Jesus said, well, I and the Father are one. Oh, for which they picked up stones to stone him. For which of my works, which of my miracles do you stone me? Not for your works, but for your words, because you being a man, make yourself out to be God. And then Jesus responded to them and says, wait a minute, the scriptures cannot be broken. And in the scriptures, God called them gods to whom the word of God came. And what Jesus is saying is, if God could call non-gods gods, then don't I, the Son of God, sent into the world, who really is God, don't I have the right to call myself God? So there are some difficult passages, but to say the Jews were polytheistic is just false. Heiser also incorrectly believed the Old Testament Jews shared the same cosmology, the same view of the universe as the pagans. He's wrong. The Jews didn't believe in a disc-shaped flat earth standing on pillars. And the Old Testament doesn't teach that. Okay? And you're watering down inerrancy or just denying inerrancy if you say that. Now, sometimes they use the pillars of the earth. Sometimes they use the language of their contemporaries. It didn't mean that they share the same faulty scientific views. Really, when it comes down to, Heiser denies that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. He thought it was written hundreds of years later, maybe even 1,000 years later. Okay? So he's got problems there, and then his divine council views are extreme. I agree that God appointed angels that are involved in the governmental affairs of mankind, but this idea that he had a group of angels that would assemble and help him make decisions and things of that sort. You know, God does delegate authority. He delegated to human government the authority to bring justice, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But his views of the divine council are really extreme. I think where Michael Heiser went wrong, he died of cancer not too long ago, but where I think he went wrong was that he saw a similarity between the terminology of the Old Testament and the terminology of the ancient false belief systems, the ancient pagans. And so he thought similarity in terms equals similarity in beliefs, okay? I don't even remember the name of the author. It's called Against the Gods. He was an Old Testament scholar who said, no, the similarity in terminology between the Old Testament and the pagans was for polemic reasons. In other words, the Jews were in dialogue with them and were refuting them. They weren't saying, hey, we agree with the pagans on that type of thing. So we got a little bit of time for questions, and so hopefully we learned a little and nobody was offended, and the half Portuguese, half Italian will leave this place in one piece tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Phil, for that presentation. Let's give him a hand. Okay, if you have a
wow.
question, put up your hand and I'll bring the mic around so you can hear the question as well as the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, there's a typo in the slide, very significant one, especially in these modern times, where the slide starts, those who disagreed. I have the sons of Seth married the sons of Cain as one of the. There's no sons of Seth married the daughters of Cain. Yeah, so that's a typo. So make sure you correct that. Slide number 10.
Hi, Phil. Quick one for you. One of the early slides stated that, down here, one of the early slides stated that it was the fallen angels intermarrying, producing offspring, the giants. What and at what point in time caused that to cease?
Okay, now I'm really bad at hearing.
Sorry.
So.
Is that a little better? Okay. One of the early sides was referring to the demons, the fallen angels intermarrying, producing giants, offspring, right?
No, fallen angels
intermarrying with
female
daughters,
humans.
female humans. Yes, exactly. Producing giants, producing the giant offspring. At what point in time would that have ceased? Why does it not happen? Why do we see no evidence of it now?
Well, I don't think we see it now. But you can get back to reports of the 1500s, 1600s, maybe even the 1700s they're usually in desolated places here in America until the Native Americans came. They're usually called the mound builders. They find in the mounds these entities. But there have been some recent reports, like in Afghanistan, but it's almost always an anonymous source. So, I'm just going to suspend judgment on those. But the thing is, if you see a person who's 8'2", pray for them. They probably have that disease and all. They're not, and the thing is too is no matter how big a person I see or how small a person I see, I'm going to preach Jesus. And if they come to Jesus, we know they're going to heaven. With these entities here, they're a perversion of God's creation. And did some of them live on, or were there just really big, huge groups of people? You can see with the disease how regular-sized parents could have these huge children. But when you get entire tribes of these giants, then you scratch your head, especially when there were reports of them probably being in the realm of 8 or 9 feet tall, like Magellan's and Patagonians. But yeah, good question there, brother.
Question.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Fernandes, for the views I myself hold to the supernatural view myself. And I have a question, but I'll make a comment. I was thankful to you to hit on a little bit about Michael Heiser. He used to write for Gospel Coalition, and a lot of extreme views. So thank you for sharing that. One of my questions comes from, I feel that the current worship of Hinduism, where we see hybrid gods, where we have like the worship of Ganesh, there's a big statue, or even in Bethel, half human, half hybrid, elephant, and half animal. In their scriptures, there is also the god Hanuman, which went in and destroyed Sri Lanka as well, is half ape, half human. And when the giants, when the Nephilims did come back, they're supposed to go in and settle in the region of Mesopotamia as well, and which is the crossing of many rivers, and India has many rivers crossing it. Do you feel, from your study, I feel from my little bit of study, I feel that there is a great concentration of Nephilims in the Hindu scriptures and in Hinduism, where 330 million gods are half human and half animals, hybrid?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I have a friend who's kind of an undercover missionary in India. He originally grew up there and came out of Hinduism, accepted Christ, and I asked him in front of my students at the high school I teach at, are these Hindu entities, these Hindu so-called gods, are they just products of the Hindus' imagination, or are they real demonic entities? And he said, yes, they're real demonic entities. And he even talked about some of the encounters that he's had out there. I think that you have much more knowledge on it than myself, and than probably many of the people here. I think a lot of us, if we went to India and saw their statues or looked at pictures of them online and stuff like that, we would be incredibly shocked. That's one good contribution from Michael Heiser, is that what he's basically saying is we shouldn't be shocked because the Bible is filled with this kind of stuff, okay? Now, he makes some other problematic things, but I do think, not his supernatural view, but I do think we need to view things through supernatural lenses. Like, for instance, if our neighbor says, look, there's objects levitating in my house and scratching on the walls and this and that, and I can't explain it, and could you come and check it out? We usually tell them, oh, you're probably just imagining it. We sound like atheists. We sound like we don't believe supernatural things happen anymore. And so I do think that we need to really look at the Old Testament. Old Testament scholars who translate the Old Testament for us are usually very kind, because they'll translate certain words in a word that makes us feel comfortable, like goat, when the demonic entity hanging out in the wilderness and in desert places sounds a lot more monstrous. And so, yeah, no, I do think that I don't know the exact level of fallen angel interference and demonic interference with the Hindu religions, but it's like over the top, big time. I mean, but I think the Bible, the biblical worldview, will cause us to see. And so many Hindus that have come to Christ, as soon as they come to Christ, they see it for exactly what it is. But if we just think pagans just make up false gods of their own imagination, that's usually not the case. Now, but by the way, Isaiah deals with both, with the Freudian projection, gods that we just kind of make up, we create our own gods, but he also deals with the false gods that are not real gods, but they're real entities. They're demonic entities, and I think Joseph Smith was actually, and Muhammad, were actually visited by real spiritual entities, which empowered them to start the false religions that they started. But yeah, Hinduism is, C.S. Lewis said, the final battle for the souls of mankind will be fought between Christianity, the most exclusive religion, salvation through one person, the Lord Jesus, and Hinduism, the most inclusive, all religions lead to God. And I was witnessing to a Hindu lady, you could tell, elderly lady with the garb on and the spot on her forehead, and I explained to her that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and that he's the only way for us to be saved. And she said, "Oh, yes, I agree." And I said, "No, you don't. You think he's one of the only way. If a person doesn't trust in Jesus, they won't be saved." And she said, "Oh, no, I don't agree with that." And so it's kind of like you can have whatever beliefs you want and add it all up. And I do think that this demonic tolerance that says all beliefs are equally true, all behaviors equally wholesome, but then it turns around and say, "Oh, if you disagree with us, we can't tolerate you." And we're going to see that. We're already seeing that battle right now. So, but yeah, we probably need to talk more.
Okay, another question here, Phil.
Okay.
We see through Scripture and throughout history Satan's hatred for mankind, and it appears. My thinking is he's obviously messing with the human genetics throughout history. What's your thoughts on modern day genetic engineering, etc.?
Yeah, really good question. With like transhumanism, and we were really going after animal human chimeras. Now we're moving in the direction of human machine chimeras. A really good book to read on that topic is Homo Deus, the God Man, and it's a guy who promotes that kind of garbage. Yuval Noah Harari, he's endorsed by Bill Gates, former President Obama, and Klaus Schwab, former head of the World Economic Forum. A bunch of demonic globalists and stuff love him. And but these guys think they're going to live to be 140, 145 by replacing some of the human parts with computer human machines, and they're going to be the man gods. And they're hoping that when they get to about age 130, 140, we'll find a cure for death, and then they'll live forever. But in the meantime, it's really scary what they want to do with the rest of us, because AI can upkeep their roads so they can drive their limousines on, and their airports so they could fly their private jets there. So they don't really need us anymore. And we're going to be worthless eaters. And for a while, they're going to entertain us, says Yuval Noah Harari, with computer games, virtual reality, and drugs. But eventually, AI, the algorithms are going to say, look, the number one problem is climate change. The number one cause of the problem are human beings. Let's wipe out all the human beings except the ones who are filtering in all the information to us. They get an exemption. And so that's why Elon Musk has spilled the beans on this. He's not into depopulation. But yeah, I think when it comes to the transhumanism movement, where man is trying to become God and we're messing with the genetic code, with human stupidity like that, who needs demons? So if some of Satan's fallen angels came to him and said, hey, let's have a third round of the Nephilim, he'd say, no, the humans are doing it themselves. So it's really, really a crazy time to be alive.
Okay, one question here.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one, why would God create the angels with the ability to have sex with a human and procreate? Why would he give them that ability? Why would they have?
Yeah, I don't know. Why would he give create angels with the ability to take on bodily form so they can eat food and have a digestive system? I don't know. Why would God create, humans that he knew would disobey him and angels that he knew would disobey him? I don't know. But God he foreknows everything that's going to happen, and he allows the evil that occurs for purposes of a greater good. So that question, whether I'm right or wrong, if I'm right, that question's a question probably only God could answer. So.
Okay, my second question is, if you think there were Nephilim after the flood, then there are people walking around today who are part angel?
No, I don't believe that. There are some reports, but they're almost always from anonymous or not good sources. But all I'm saying is we do have something of most of the great travelers, Columbus, Magellan, Vespucci, their chroniclers reported tribes of giants. Now, were they just big people? They could have been just big people. I don't know. But the heights of some of the reports make me wonder if as the Jews... See, I also agree with Tim Chaffee that the genocide, the cities where the Jews were to wipe out all people when they conquered the Promised Land, also happened to be the cities that were known for being infested with giants. And now, did some of those giants flee and go to other places? And did the Native Americans deal with them? I don't know. But we do get some interesting reports and all. But that's just why I said, if I see a big person, and I'm not talking 7-footers, but if I bumped into a 11-foot person, I'm just going to preach Jesus, okay? And if they were a Nephilim, I think that's a twisting of God's creation. So I don't think that they would have any desire to come to Christ. But no, I don't think there's any, but I do think that there's some very interesting reports. I think more research needs to be done. By the way, I'm just asking that we, just as far as giants, totally separate from the issue of the Nephilim, I'm just saying we should pick up on the research that was being done before Darwinian evolution. Okay, I mean, with Darwinian evolution, it influenced even us. So most of our pastors date certain books of the Bible way later than scholars did in the late 1800s and early 1900s, before Darwinian thought infested our seminaries. So, is somebody else?
Okay, so thank you for answering those questions, and let's give him a hand for his presentation. And Phil has a bunch of books on the table. Phil, say a few words about your books. I know you don't have all of them there.
The books are free, and then we cut them to like half price if there's still any remaining at the end. But the books are free. If you want to write a donation, write it to TBF, Trinity Bible Fellowship, and then we'll just take that money and buy more books to give away for free. So if you get a chance to check them out, they all deal with apologetics, evidence for God's existence, evidence for Jesus' resurrection, evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. I think there's a couple of booklets there on refuting the Jesus myth hypothesis, this really crazy idea that Jesus never existed. But if any of those books will help you or help a friend in their defense of the faith or answer objections for a non-believer, they're free, and you can just pick up a couple on the way out. So, but God bless you, everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Phil. And the Apologetics Forum, we have a number of book tables there with the books, answers books, and books from the major creation ministries. And also, we got a whole bunch of DVDs, and we've reduced the price on the DVDs because we're trying to move them. So take a look at the reduced prices there. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And also remember, if you want to get on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table, and there's flyers on the back table for upcoming events. Next time we have Tim from ICR. He's up there now. Tim is the director of ICR Research, and he's got a PhD in geology himself. And he's going to be talking on the topic of secrets of superfaults. Now, what are superfaults? Well, that is about the mountains and the sediment layers. How are they twisted and they look different? It's not their gradual laying down. How did that happen? So he's going to talk about the catastrophic events of the flood, which caused some of the formations that we see. So he'll be here on the 20th of June. And some of you may know that he's also speaking in SeaTac. He's going to be here Friday night, the 20th, and then he's going to be speaking at a SeaTac church on the 21st and 22nd. So he's got multiple purposes for coming out here. And remember, this ministry is supported by donations. If you care to do a donation, there's 2 boxes in the back there, but you can also do it online, just through PayPal or credit card or whatever. That's all set up. Just look for the donate button. So, you met Ron. Ron is the one that does the tours, and he'll be available to answer any questions about the tours. He's in the doorway there. We have a few other board members as well. I don't see Bill. He's here somewhere. Bill is our treasurer. Yeah, he's in the back there. And then Barry sitting beside him. He's the other board member. And then, of course, Pastor Rick from this church. He is also on our board. So we have 5 board members, and they're all here. So you can ask them all the hard questions. It's not just me running this thing. It's all of us doing this. So we thank you for their efforts as well. So let me just end with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, we just thank you for this time. We thank you for Phil and his ministry, for all the work that he's done, the books that he's written, and the apologetic speaking that he does at different places here in the U.S. And we just pray that you continue to bless his ministry. We also ask for a prayer for his wife, who is going through some real physical challenges. Lord, we just pray for healing in her body as well. And we just pray for the results of this. If you've learned something new, you might want to share that with others in your purvey, whether it's a schoolmate or a colleague at work or at the church or whoever God puts in your path. Share what you've learned. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.